Hello and welcome. I'm Lisa, an account executive at PolicyBee. I usually provide this presentation to a live audience, but thought it might be a nice idea to get something online for you to watch too. As I mentioned, we're PolicyBee, a specialist independent and digital business insurance broker from Ipswich, Suffolk. We've been a business insurance broker now for over 10 years, and we've recently stepped into the world of charity insurance. Over the last year or so, we've worked closely with Hiscox Insurance to develop a low-cost insurance package for small charities. Hopefully I'll pass on some of what we've learnt so far, and it will be enough to get you thinking about what potential risks you might want to protect your charity from. So today we'll be thinking about your charity's risks, we'll be thinking about how insurance can help, and learning from past experience. So the next thing to discuss would be risk. Now, what is risk? That's a question that I would usually ask to my live audience. Some responses that I've received in the past have been the chance of something bad happening. Another person's also said sort of any negative impact that might affect the charity. So we tend to put risk into 4 categories. So what you do, so the activities, the fundraising events, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis to run your charity, where you do it, so whether you're working from an office, whether you might meet at a village hall once a week, so where you're doing it from, and who does it with you. So it might just be a panel of trustees, perhaps you might have a couple of paid employees or a few volunteers as well. And finally, what you use to do it, so the tools and the equipment you need to run your charity. So moving on now to the insurance, so professional indemnity insurance. So as an expert, you really do have a legal and moral duty of care to do your best work. If you provide the wrong advice or make a mistake or not do what's been asked of you, you're likely to see allegations under this cover made against you. I've got a really good claim example for professional indemnity. So there was a tenant in an apartment run by a local housing association. Now they were seriously attacked by another tenant. The victim successfully sues the housing association as they didn't carry out full checks of the attacker's background. So the claim was actually made for criminal assault and the insurer settled it for £7,000 in total. So that's a really good example. So the housing association hadn't carried out all the checks that they were supposed to, therefore they were proven to be negligent. Moving on now to public liability insurance. So this is a sort of more well-known insurance, and you might find that some of the venues that you hold your fundraising events from will actually require you to have this and tell you how much cover they expect you to have. This cover will actually pay for your legal bills and any compensation if you're liable for an injury to a third party or damage to a third party's property. So an example of a past claim on this one, there was a member of a charitable trust. They organised a bring and buy sale on a school playing field to raise money for a local hospice. During the day it rained. A lady slipped over and badly hurt her back, taking 3 months to fully recover. She launches a claim successfully arguing that signs should have been put out to warn that the grass can be slippery when wet. Now in actual fact that claim was successful and they did settle the claim for £900. Moving on to trustees liability. So for me this has to be one of the key insurances for charities to consider. And is why we sort of add this actually into our standard package. So I believe this cover is now better understood and more trustees are viewing it as a priority, which is great. The reason for this, of course, is because the claim can actually be made against you as an individual. So someone may allege that you've acted incorrectly in your duties and try and make a claim against you. If this was to happen, the cover would pay legal costs to defend you, as well as any compensation due to the claimant if you had been proven negligent. It's important to remember that if a claim is made against you as a trustee and you don't have the above cover, the costs would actually come out of your own pocket and have in the past resulted in trustees losing assets such as cars and houses. Again, to give you a good example of a past claim, there was a charitable wing of a local sports club. They were set up to raise money to teach children with disabilities. Sadly, the club turns into financial trouble trouble. Faced with closure, the trustees handed over a large sum of money to keep it afloat. Eventually, the Charity Commission gets wind of this and they launch a formal investigation. It finds the trustees liable because they used charity money for the larger sports club rather than for charitable means. So the claim was for breach of trust, and the total amount paid was £52,000. So as you can imagine, if that was to come out of your own pocket and the insurance wasn't in place, then that's a really significant amount to have to pay out for. Moving on now to employers' liability insurance. So if an employee gets injured whilst helping or working and it's your charity's fault, you will be held liable. If you do have paid employees, then it is a legal requirement to have this cover. One thing to note here actually is that different insurers will cover volunteers slightly differently. So we cover our volunteers under the employer's liability cover. This is because you're instructing them to carry out a task on behalf of the charity, just as you would ask an employee. The only difference, of course, is that they're not being paid to do it. Some insurers, on the other hand, will actually cover the volunteers under the public liability. So please make sure that obviously your volunteers are covered on the correct basis and are correctly insured. Just a quick example for you there of an employer's liability claim. A local charity held a bingo session for the public. One of the trustees actually asked a member of the admin staff to decorate the hall. She fell from a ladder and injured her arm. No risk assessments had been carried out, therefore she made a successful injury claim and £1,200 was paid out in total. So property and equipment insurance, this is kind of an add-on cover that you can opt to have. So if you do have an office and you have tables, chairs, computers, you might want to protect that. So if there was a fire or a flood or a theft and you needed those items replaced, then you can obviously opt to have this type of cover. There's also money cover. So if you go to fundraising events or what have you, you might wish to have some cover for the money that you're raising in case it's stolen. So that's also an added extra or an option that you can choose to have. So the next bit that we're going to talk about now then is belts and braces insurance. So these are quite interesting covers that sometimes may be forgotten about, but I again think are quite important. So the first one is called crisis containment. Now we actually add this cover onto our standard package. It's a really useful cover. So if a claim's made against you, so against the charity, the cover actually provides PR services to prevent any adverse or negative publicity. So it's really good to minimise the exposure to your charity. The next cover on this list here is business interruption. So we have the business interruption cover. Imagine if you were suddenly unable to work. So perhaps you arrived at the office and there's been a large theft or perhaps a flood. This type of cover pays the costs for you to have to move office, perhaps rent another space or lease some equipment in so that you can almost carry on as normal, preventing further loss to the charity. The next cover on this list here is cyber insurance. So we obviously hear more and more about cyber attacks these days. So you have an increased exposure if you're holding sensitive customer data, so perhaps addresses, banking information, date of births, if you're reliant on your computer systems to run your charity, if you've got a website, or if you're subject to payment card industry merchant services. So this cover will support and protect your charity, and if it experiences a breach or is subject to an attack. If you can imagine, if your systems were hacked and sensitive data about people who have actually donated money to your charity were exposed, these people are not going to be very happy and they could look to sue you. So the cyber cover is there to look to protect you and cover those costs. So moving on now to you, the insurer. This is quite interesting, and this is actually one of the activities that I'd usually add to my live presentation. However, I thought we could still give it a go online. So the idea here is for you to imagine that you're the insurer. So you need to underwrite this risk and decide if it's something you want to cover or not. It's an interesting way really of helping you see things from the insurer's point of view and also why they might ask the questions that they do. So if I just briefly read through the details of the charity, so this is just a made up charity just for this activity. So they're an educational charity, they fund groups and local individuals, they advance a musical appreciation. The charity's been running for 5 years and the income for last year was £11,000. There are 3 trustees, 100 volunteers and 1 part-time employee. They have an annual fete where there's about 300 people attending with some stalls, bouncy castles and some bingo. Then they also have their Christmas concert, so about 150 people attend, and they finish that off with a nice firework display. All right, so I've now got some questions here for you to consider. Feel free to obviously pause so you can sort of focus on this slide and perhaps jot down a few of your thoughts. You can then come back and obviously see whether you were thinking along the right lines. So if we have a look at the top one to start with, so what looks okay and what doesn't. So having a look at the details here, I think the fate itself would be okay. The bit that would be sort of riskier there would be the bouncy castle. So the insurers are nervous about this. Now, to settle their nerves, we would need to know if the person supplying the bouncy castle has their own public liability cover, and they usually like that to be at the same level as your public liability. They'd also want to know if the supplier is actually going to be supervising the bouncy castle at all times. If the insurers do consider to cover the bouncy castle with this information, you'll probably see that the premium is slightly higher to reflect that higher risk. The other thing that stood out to me here was the fireworks. So, of course, that's quite a high risk. Again, the insurers would want to know who's actually letting off the fireworks. So, is it someone perhaps that works for the charity? Do they hold a relevant license to let off fireworks? What risk assessments have been carried out? Alternatively, if you're getting a third-party company come in, do they have their own public liability insurance? So, they're all the types of things that you should be thinking of as an underwriter or an insurer. The next question here was, what other information would you ask for? So, I mean, I've picked out a couple of points here. The first one is the part-time employee. So initially you'd probably just assume that it's perhaps an admin staff member, but we shouldn't just assume. So this part-time employee could be doing anything weird and wonderful, and the insurers are going to be covering the activities of that employee. So if they're injured whilst working, then that could potentially be covered under the policy. So we really want to know what that person's doing. All right. The next thing I'd probably ask on this same one actually would be about advancing musical appreciation. Now, I'd want to question here, how do they actually go about doing that? So do they go into schools and talk about music? Do they run a music club from the local village hall and invite children to come and play an instrument perhaps? So I'd want to ask a little bit more around that. So the next one here is, what insurance do you think they need? Well, really, the obvious ones stand out to be the employer's liability cover, of course, for the employee and the volunteers they've got. The trustees' liability, as they've got the 3 trustees. Public liability, of course, because they're holding these events for the public. Professional indemnity could be applicable if they're giving advice. And all of the add-ons and the belts and braces insurance that we discussed before could be applicable. And the more and more you spoke to this client and the more information you got about the charity, the better kind of fit or bespoke you could make the policy for them. The final question just here on the slide was, what level of cover do you think they need? Now, this is a really tricky question, and one that my clients ask me a lot actually. So the truth is, there is really no right or wrong answer, unless of course a contract has specifically told you how much cover they would expect you to have. The thing to consider is not only the amount that someone may sue you for, but also the legal costs involved too. So we've actually found in the past that legal fees can end up being more than the compensation was to start with. So I'd really recommend here sort of asking your broker for a few different options of cover in your quote so you can compare premiums. This may help with your decision making, because sometimes doubling the level of cover doesn't necessarily mean doubling the premium you're going to pay. So that's the tip that I would probably give on this one there. So moving on to who can actually help you. So of course, any reputable broker can arrange your insurance or help with your insurance. If you are unsure about which broker can help with your specific insurance needs, we would always recommend the British Insurance Brokers Association. They have access to lots of brokers and will know which one specifically would be of most help to you. They did help over 250,000 people last year with their insurance, and if I ever speak to a client that I can't help specifically, I'd always refer them over to the British Insurance Brokers Association. So this is quite an interesting question. So broker or insurer? So it's probably down to personal opinion more than anything. As a broker myself, I'll give you some of the positives about using one. So brokers are independent and they can advise. So if, say, for example, your broker found you 3 quotes, they could help and advise you based on the information of the 3 quotes which one might best fit your charity's requirements. An insurer can only provide you with the quotes. They can't then give that extra bit of advice. So that's a really, really valid point there. Brokers, of course, search the market, hopefully saving you time and money. At PolicyBee, we pride ourselves in keeping our language jargon-free, obviously keeping your documents easy to read, being picky, of course, about the insurers that we're using to provide the best cover and service to you. We do listen to our customers, we stay away from call centres, and of course we stay digital. So they're just some of the advantages of using a broker. So that sort of brings the presentation to a close. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you do have any questions at all, or you'd just like to have a chat about your charity insurance, then please feel free to give us a call. Of course, we've got email, Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook, so plenty of options, and we'll look forward to hearing from you. Thanks very much.